Let's now take up the topic of the blood. The picture that you see here is from your textbook and really does a nice job in summarizing all of the major elements of the blood and the basic things that we want to learn. So if you refer to this, if you can talk your way through this, if you've learned what you see on this handout, you've really got a good foundation for understanding the blood and the role it plays in the human body. As you may remember, the blood is a connective tissue. That means that it's mostly matrix. And the blood does have a matrix. It's called the plasma. Notice that the plasma is 55% of the blood. So there's more plasma than there are cellular components here. Cellular components are called formed elements and make up only about 45% of the blood. Now, that cellular component varies with age, it varies with sex. Males tend to have a slightly higher percentage. Females have a slightly lower percentage. It's going to be a higher percentage in youth than there will be in older people. So there is some variety, but there are norms for each age and sex. The cellular elements we called formed elements, and we should probably clarify that. When we say formed elements, what we mean is these things are formed by cells, but are not necessarily cells themselves. Okay? You'll see that there are three items in the formed elements area. They're all formed by cells. Only the white blood cells are actually cells. The red blood cells are in one way misnamed. They're the size of a cell, but they themselves are technically not cells, and neither are the platelets. As we talk about the amount of plasma and the amount of formed elements, we should talk about the hematocrit. The hematocrit is an important blood test that simply tries to ascertain how much of the blood is formed elements and how much is plasma. And it's a very simple test in many ways. Today it's done with machines. We used to do this in our physiology labs and have students prick their finger, take their own blood. The blood is put into a tiny, tiny little tube we call a capillary tube. It's put in a centrifuge like the one you see in this picture and spun around. And of course the heavier formed elements settle in the bottom of the tube, and the plasma moves to the top of the tube. And you can see right there in the picture there are two little capillary tubes, one from a male and one from a female. And all you have to do is just measure, the whole amount of blood there and say what percentage are the formed elements, what percentage is the plasma. And it was a very, very simple test. And it's still done today, because if your blood has too many formed elements or too few formed elements, there's something wrong. And a simple test like this can often tell you right away important things about the disease states of the human body. So you want to make sure that you know the test called the hematocrit. Okay? Now let's go back to those three major elements of the blood. And we'll first talk about the amount of blood that there is. In the human body, this picture from the textbook says that the blood is 8% by weight. And I don't know how important that is. That seems like a funny thing. I would rather us talk about blood volume, because this is how you measure if somebody has lost some blood. Have they lost enough, too much? Much more important that you understand how much blood there is in the human body. And I wonder if anybody knows. Do you know how much there is? In the average size human body, yours might be smaller, yours might be larger, but in the average human body, there are approximately 12 pints of blood. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the English system, but 12 pints is the same as 6 quarts. So if you can visualize, say, a quart of milk, 6 of those filled with blood is the amount of blood that would be circulating within the average size human body. Smaller person less, a bigger person more. Now, although pints and quarts might be more familiar to us, medical work uses the metric system. And so we should have some concept here. And the quart really helps us out here, because a quart is almost identical to, in the English system, what is called a liter. So they're within an ounce of each other, and so it's not hard to just translate that in your mind, and when you see a quart, think, oh, that's the same thing as a liter. We do know liters these days, especially if you purchase soft drinks in the supermarket. You purchase soft drinks in what? Yeah, typically in 2-liter bottles, right, that look like this. So if a liter is a quart, and there's 6 quarts or 6 liters, then 3 of those 2-liter bottles would be the total amount of volume, of blood volume, in the average sized human body. And I think that helps. If you saw somebody bleeding and there was a 2-liter bottle's worth of blood on the floor or bleeding out, you'd know that that person is very much in trouble, that they'd lost perhaps a third of their blood supply. It'd be very, very difficult to keep blood pressure up if you'd lost that much blood. It's just like your tire doesn't maintain its pressure if it has a leak. So we do, though, at times donate blood. It's a very important activity to maintain our local blood supply, and we always encourage people to donate blood. Typical donation amount of blood is a pint, or half of 1 liter, or a quarter of that 2-liter bottle. And a person of average size can safely donate that amount. There are some concerns when you donate blood. If you are under a certain amount of weight, then a pint of your blood would be more proportionally than in the average sized person. And so there are weight limits that they have for donating blood. So now let's go back to those 3 elements of the plasma. Now, of course, the plasma is mostly water. You can see from the diagram 91%. Some books say 92, some say 90, somewhere in there. I just like it to be simple, so I just want us to say, well, 90%, 10% is something else. And the other 2 components that you see there are the proteins and the solutes. So let's discuss the proteins for a moment. They are the larger of those 2, and the majority of that other 10%. So what are plasmas doing? What are proteins doing running around in our plasma? Well, proteins have several roles to play. These proteins are produced by the liver, but probably the most important one is their osmotic role. It's difficult to talk about this right now if you haven't discussed diffusion and osmosis before. If you've been in a biology class before, then you have undoubtedly encountered the terms diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion just explains the movement of materials from one fluid space to another. And It actually can be broader than that. It can actually be vapors moving around a room. Any molecular substance that can freely move will tend to distribute itself evenly within the space that it belongs. For example, if you open a perfume bottle in a room, the perfume molecules will be concentrated at the bottle and very, very dilute throughout the room. But if you let the top off the bottle, slowly but surely, as the molecules of the air just randomly move, the molecules of the perfume would be equally distributed sooner or later throughout the entire room. That would just be a random movement of molecules, which is the basis for diffusion. Osmosis, if you know that term, is a form of diffusion, and it's a form of the diffusion of water. So when we say osmosis, we're talking specifically about how water would move. And water, of course, is fluid. The molecules are constantly moving. And so water is going to move. But where is it going to move? Well, it's going to move in cellular spaces. Let's talk about cells. You remember our study of cells. When you look at a diagram like this or any of the other cells, you can see that there's lots of proteins. All the dark structural objects in the cell are proteins. But all the rest of that space inside the cell is filled with fluid. So there's a combination of proteins and fluid. The fluid amount here is about what it is in the human body. Now compare that to plasma. Okay? Plasma is 90%. So we have a difference between the amount of water in a cell and the amount of water in the plasma. Water is going to move towards dilution. So if you looked at these two numbers and water was going to move but the proteins weren't, water would move from where it's highly concentrated at 91% toward where it's more dilute at 66%. Here's a picture with some water and some protein. The little black circles that you see would be proteins. And we've got a membrane in this jar between the two, like the membrane of a cell. And if this was the case that the water could move but the proteins couldn't, water would move from where it's highly concentrated on our left toward where it's less concentrated on the right. So this water would move like this, okay? And it would actually move against any other pressures. The molecules of water are just trying to equally distribute themselves. And the fact that there's more protein over there means that that side is going to be have more total material in it on the right side than there is on the left. This kind of process can lead to something like this. This condition is called edema, and it happens when there is an excess movement of water from the bloodstream into the tissues for whatever reason. Usually it's a problem, pardon me, usually it's a problem with the osmotic balance. So proteins are very important here. If there's some protein in the plasma, then we have less movement. So you can see in this picture I've put a few protein molecules in the plasma side, the side on our left, and now you can compare the two. Compare what would be happening for the movement of water when plasma has proteins in it versus when it doesn't. And this is the whole concept, that protein in the plasma causes the plasma to retain more water. Not as much water moves into the tissues. Some water is constantly moving, but not too much to cause that swelling we saw. And there are other disease conditions like this. Maybe you've seen this. A protein deficiency in children, often in third world countries where they have diets that don't have enough protein. The liver doesn't have enough raw materials. It doesn't make enough protein for the blood. And even though the tissues in most of the body are wasting away, fluid will collect in the abdominal area and create a large gut, which is just mostly fluid that's moving out into those tissues. So proteins are very, very important. And regulation and the production of proteins is what helps manage the movement of fluids. Another disease state is alcoholism. The end stages of alcoholism, because alcoholism destroys much of the liver isn't capable of producing proteins, and so typically the alcoholic sometime before death becomes very, very bloated, very, very edemic throughout their human body. And it's a direct result of that loss of protein. So, now, there are 3 types of proteins that are found in the plasma. So particularly 3 different types. And each of these may have a secondary role. The first one that you see there, the one that's over half of all the protein, is simply called albumin. And these are just inert osmotic proteins. They really don't have an extra role to play. The white of an egg is albumin. That protein is the basic building block of the chicken that's going to develop from that raw material that's inside the egg. So with albumin, I would just think 60%. I'm not worried about 38%. The second one that you see here is called a globulin. There are actually several types of globulins. They all have functions within the immune system. The liver produces them in an effort to fight infection and disease. There's globulins called alpha, beta, and gamma globulins. We will sometimes give a patient an injection of the gamma globulin protein if their immune fighting ability is compromised somehow. So albumins for osmosis, although all of the proteins function osmotically, but globulins in a secondary way are ones for the immune system. And then the third one, fibrinogen, is part of what it takes to form a blood clot. And notice that fibrinogen is a very small amount, 4%. I usually just think 5%. I usually think 60% albumins, 35% globulins, and 5% fibrinogen. In the picture that you see here, you can see the red blood cells stuck to the fibers that have been formed from fibrinogen. And we should probably just stop for a moment and just talk about one other aspect of a protein that is very important to our discussion of fibrinogen. Proteins can have dual natures. Take, for example, a chicken egg, and that what we call the white or clear part of the egg, at room temperature, it has one nature to it. It's fluid and runny, especially if you haven't left it in the refrigerator. If it's been out on the kitchen counter for a while and you open it up and break it open, you'll note that that white part of the egg is very, very fluid-like. All you have to do is add a little heat, and that egg white becomes very, very hard and rubbery. So it's the same exact protein, but a different environmental condition. And any number of conditions, not just environmental, not just heat, it can be pH, it can be the presence of other chemicals. A number of things can change the nature of a protein. This illustrates the three states of a protein. It can have a primary, secondary, and tertiary nature. And if the primary state does not change, but if the secondary or tertiary states change, then the protein assumes a different nature or a different look to it. And so the fibrinogen is part of the liquid, the plasma, the blood. You can't see it, it's dissolved there, but given certain environmental conditions, that liquid protein can change to a stringy protein, one that then sticks to other fibers, sticks to blood cells, and begins to form a mass of tissue that creates what we call a blood clot. Okay? So, three types of proteins. Okay? Albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. Now, the last element in the plasma are the other solutes. Now, you remember the term solute from chemistry, right? Something dissolved in a solution. The solvent is what dissolves. The solute is what gets dissolved. So, 2% of the plasma, and since the plasma is approximately half of the blood, 1% of the entire blood, but 2% of the plasma are the materials that are dissolved in it, and this, of course, is what is being carried by the blood. We said the whole purpose of the blood is transportation. So, this element right here is the purpose of the blood. Everything that's going to get transported is dissolved in the blood. Right? All things. And in your handout, or in your picture in your book, it gives a short list of 5 things that are a part of what is dissolved. I just think it's amazing to think that this is the whole purpose of the blood, and yet only 1% of the entire blood is actually what is being moved and delivered to the tissues. So let's go through these elements. Ions, very important mineral type elements that you get from your food, from your nutrition. And so many of the cell membrane and other activities are governed electrochemically, and it takes charged particles, ions, to do these things. So ions are very important. Nutrients, of course, the food that you eat, the raw materials, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, all of these nutrients are very important. We've talked about waste products, carbon dioxide, nitrogenous wastes, things that are produced that are poisonous by the cells have to be picked up by the blood and transported to where they can be eliminated. Gases too, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, any number of gases that are naturally in our atmosphere are dissolved in the water of the plasma and are carried about. And finally, not things that come from outside of us, but regulatory substances, which would include hormones and other substances called prostaglandins, are very important from one place to another. You may have a gland that produces a hormone, but it has effects throughout the human body. Well, that hormone needs to be transferred from the gland to those other body tissues. And so that's also being transported here. There is just one substance in this whole scheme that can't be transported in enough quantities to meet the demands of the human body. Everything is dissolved here, but not enough of one substance. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, because the formed elements of the blood, one of those three elements has a very, very important role to play in that. And we'll see that shortly. So, plasma has three major components, right? Water, those proteins for osmotic purposes, and the dissolved substances. Okay? And that is the first part of our lecture on the blood, covering the plasma of the blood.